Hello everybody and welcome to the screencast. It has been a minute since I've done one of these, and I would like to thank everyone who has followed me over the past months, as well as people who've taken time to send me emails and questions. It's been really great to hear from you all. I'm super glad you're finding all of these helpful. Today's is going to be a little bit scruffy because my school has gone to remote learning, which means some of the stuff that I normally do in class, I'm flipping as lectures so my students can have access to information. So you might hear my dog jingling around in the background or chewing her bone because she finds all this incredibly exciting. I hope you will excuse it while I work through some of the issues that we cover in our literature classes. We are under some time pressures, so this isn't going to be as edited as much as I normally would one of my videos, so there's probably going to be some verbal gunk and some ums and some ahs and things like that in there. I'll ask that you be patient with those. And I've got a content warning. There are a couple of bad words coming up later on in the screencast. Not really bad ones, I'm saving those up for later, but I do want to give you a warning about those things. So today we are talking about verbal irony. I teach in the United States. Got to slow down. People have said, don't talk so fast. And here in the U.S., my students often have a really hard time with verbal irony when they encounter it in print. They don't have so much trouble orally, but print gives them troubles, and that seems to be the case for a lot of Americans, in fact. We're pretty good at hearing it when it's spoken, though when it's dry it can be especially tough. But when it is in print, all bets are off. In fact, there's a reason why people get angry about articles on The Onion, like this one, which was just published yesterday, in fact, on the 16th. I think this is part of the reason why emojis have become so popular, is they help to communicate when you mean something to be humorous or ironic, when it can be taken as snotty or sarcastic or just plain old denigrating. This does make life difficult if you're studying literature, being that it's written in an emoji-free zone. And it doesn't help that it's British literature that my students are studying, because the British have been doing verbal irony for a very, very long time, and they're really, really good at it. So first, let's define this thing. Verbal irony is a type of irony. I know, what? Duh. Irony is all about opposition. And in this case, verbal irony is a rhetorical figure of opposition. An important thing to remember is you see a lot of these definitions floating around where the thing you find on the web says that verbal irony is saying the opposite of what you mean, and while that is a type of verbal irony, it is not the only type of verbal irony. And saying it's that throws a big old wet blanket on a couple other types of irony that don't actually do that, and I'm going to cover those in the screencast as we're coming up. What we are going to be looking at are three types of verbal irony. The first one is meaning reversal, the second is understatement, and the third is litotes. So type 1, meaning rehearsal. Basically, this is when, like most of the definitions you find online say, you say the opposite of what you mean. For example, I got a little story for you. My wife and I were traveling in Scotland, and we were up way north in the country on a Sunday, and all the people in town had gone to church. And then after the service, I guess what the tradition in this town was, you get down to church, and while you're all dressed up in your Sunday clothes, you kind of do an outing. So people were walking along the quay, they were having tea, and the shops are going out for lunch, and they're all dressed up. They're all in their Sunday best. My wife and I were just kind of walking around after we had our breakfast. And we saw this little boy and this little girl standing on the quay fishing. When you're that far north, the tide runs really big and it runs really fast. It's not like this slow coming in of the tide and this slow going out. So they're fishing and the tide is running out, and this little boy, he's got his pole and he's got his bobber and he's flinging the line out there. And he's not really getting anything, and I don't know if he was getting frustrated or bored or what. But what he did finally was he took his bobber off his line and he threw it out in the water, like, whoop, and then plunk, into the water it went. And because the tide was running, you could see the bobber, not just like sitting on the water, but it was heading out to sea. And he stood there kind of just dejected looking at it as it was going. And his sister turned to him in her pretty little British Sunday going to church dress and said, "Oh, well done." And we both cracked up because it was just the most perfectly British undercutting of a behavior that you could ever want to hear. That is an example of meaning reversal because she meant the exact opposite of what she said. I mean, if he intended to throw his bobber out in the water and have it go out in the ocean, then he had in fact done a great job, but probably that is not what his intention was, and so her telling him that it was well done was in fact saying, yeah, you are not so bright, kid. Here's a famous example from literature. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculties, in form and moving! How express and admirable in action! How like an angel in apprehension! How like a god! The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. All of that sounds pretty good. You feel kind of good about yourself as a person when you hear that. We're noble, we're infinite, we're express and admirable. All of these wonderful things. We're godlike in our abilities. The problem is that is not all of what Hamlet said, and a lot of verbal irony, particularly meaning reversal, depends on context, and that is the case here. So what you're looking at now is the same quote in the context of what Hamlet says in this much larger speech. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why, it appeareth nothing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculties, in form and moving! How express and admirable in action! How like an angel in apprehension! How like a god! The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, what to me is this quintessence of dust? No, man delights not me. Hamlet is not saying that people are great, although that last couple of lines might seem like he is saying that. Hamlet is saying that he is in fact disgusted by people. The context of his speech is that he finds the world worthless and people right along with them. It's really important to look at context when you are looking at verbal irony in print because you've got to see where the character is in his or her mind when they're doing their talking. And you always have to be aware that what something looks like on the surface might not be what is actually meant by the thing or how it might look when it's taken out of that context. Sometimes, though, context can be murky. This is especially true when you're reading drama and there aren't a lot of stage directions to help you out. This is because drama is an open form. It's indeterminate. A lot of meaning in a performance depends on how actors say their lines, along with things like their blocking, their proxemic relationships to each other, and how they react to what other characters have just said to them. This is why it can be hard to pick up on verbal irony when you're reading a play in print. This screen that you're looking at here is a clip from George Bernard Shaw's Mrs. Warren's Profession. I've got some mixed feelings about Shaw. He could be a horrible old gasbag, but when he was on, and in Mrs. Warren's Profession, he was on. For my students, this passage is early in Act 1 on page 843 of the version we're reading. I have stripped out some stage directions, so it's just the dialogue, also so everything can fit on the screen. For those of you who aren't reading Shaw, here is what's going on in the scene so far. Vivi and Praed have just met, literally minutes ago. Vivi is Mrs. Warren's daughter. Praed is a well-to-do friend of Mrs. Warren. There's been a little verbal jousting between the two of them, but nothing serious. They're sounding each other out. One telling little moment is that Vivi has refused to let Praed pull out a chair for her. She pulls out a chair for him instead. Along with this, Vivi's already indicated that her mother likes playing mind games. Her mom was supposed to be present when Praed arrived to meet Vivi, because Praed is the only one of her mother's friends that Vivi's ever asked to meet. And as a result, she's a little annoyed with her mother because she thinks her mom's clowning around again. A little note for people as you're looking at this. Shaw did a couple of things with apostrophes that is a little confusing for people. He didn't like them. He thought that, particularly in drama, they were pointless because you can't hear an apostrophe. So he tended to strip them out of his contractions. He didn't do it all the time, and you can see that in Praed's first speech. He kept it in I'm, but he pulled it in hasn't. I think that's because sometimes if you take an apostrophe out, it can just make a word confusing, particularly for the actor who's reading the line, might not know what the word is. I'm not sure about that. You're going to have to consult a Shaw scholar, and if anyone wants to send me an email or a note about that, I would be happy to hear it. I am going to stop talking for a second so you can pause the video, read the passage over for yourself. Read it a couple times, and then hit play again, and we'll do some discussion of what's going on in this little passage. Okay, so it is not clear at all to me what Vivi was expecting Praed to be, or that she's at all impressed with what she has found. When she says, "Do you know, you are just like what I expected," it could be that he is exactly like what she expected. It could be that he is a supercilious snot, and that she is not surprised by this, given his social status and her attitudes. It could be that he is refreshingly unconventional, and so she's happy about that. It's really hard to read, particularly this early in the play, because you really don't know Vivi that well. By the time you're finished it, you can probably go back and make an estimation of whether she's being ironic here or not. But at the moment, this line is really ambiguous, because it could also mean that she didn't expect what she got. This would be a very British thing to do, in fact, is saying, "You are just like what I expected," when you mean, "I did not expect this at all." It could be that she wanted, or was expected, or was led to believe that she was going to get some kind of radical, unconventional guy, and his reaction to her pulling out the chair for him rather than allowing him to do the gentlemanly thing and pull it out for her has gotten him all fussed up, and now she's making fun of him or commenting on his conventionality, particularly given that he thinks he's some sort of radical dude. It's not clear to me that Praed is any kind of an anarchist because of what I just said. He might like the idea of overthrowing authority and being a guy who runs against the grain of his social class, but his reaction to the chair pulling incident could be revealing. He might just like calling himself a radical. He could like saying it in order to shock people, particularly Vivi. He could be saying it to curry favor with kids and their wacky ideas about anarchy and overthrowing the established authority. Really, he doesn't agree with that at all. He could actually think he is an anarchist, which would be another kind of irony altogether, and I'll maybe cover that in a later podcast. But he could be saying, "I am not a born anarchist. I don't hate authority. I actually kind of like the status quo, and your behaviors so far are kind of putting me off my game." This cluster that I've highlighted here, I think, has a whole bunch of stuff going on in it. So when you see that first deer, you'll notice that it's all spread out. This is a thing that Shaw liked to do when he was indicating emphasis of a word. Rather than use italics, he would just spread the words out and put spaces in between the letters to make an actor kind of hang on the thing. So I think Praed's kind of leaning in on the deer a little bit here, more than he needs to, and he could be basically saying Vivi is a little less than dear to him. His line, "I'm glad your mother hasn't spoilt you," could mean that Vivi is not spoiled. She is unconventional and he's happy about it. Or it could mean that Vivi has been spoiled in the sense that she's been ruined. Spoiled can mean two different things in this context, and it's kind of ambiguous which one it is. Also, the fact that Vivi is very direct in her speech. She's not giving Praed any room to hide or any kind of conventional space in which to be polite, might be kind of annoying him too and make him regard her as spoiled. He might think she's a little too unconventional, or she's not conventional enough, and he might not at all be relieved to find out that she is not conventional at all. He might not find it charming to say that she was disposed to be friends to me, because that's kind of brash for a woman at this time, particularly an unmarried woman, to march up to a guy that she has never met before this point and basically stick out her hand and say, "Let's be pals." That's could be charming, but it could also be offensively forward to him. And when he says, "You modern young ladies are splendid, perfectly splendid," he could be enthusiastic and delighted by her freshness and her new attitudes, or it could be that he finds her to be awful in a whole bunch of different ways. This passage is from Act 2 of Mrs. Warren's Profession. It's on page 854 of the version that we are studying. In this passage, Mrs. Warren is telling her daughter about how Mrs. Warren came to her profession by detailing her career before she changed up. The Lizzie that's referenced in the first line is Mrs. Warren's sister. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to stop talking for a second. You go ahead and pause, read it a couple times, and then hit play, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, there are all kinds of ironies in this passage, but we're focusing in particular on this last sentence. That was considered a great promotion for me. I do not doubt that being promoted to a 14-hour-a-day job, serving drinks and washing dishes, was considered to be a big step up for a poor working-class girl like Mrs. Warren, particularly by polite society. I think Mrs. Warren knows it was considered a big deal. There's no evidence in the play that Mrs. Warren is an idiot. She's very socially aware, and so I think she knows exactly what was going on. But I am not so sure she agrees that it was a great promotion. I think the line can be read ironically. I think Mrs. Warren can indicate skepticism and even contempt for proper people and their moralizing, which helps to grind down the working classes and, quote, keep them in their place. And they did this all while telling the poor that this was being done for their own moral benefit. In fact, I think that this is part of the reason why Shaw got in some hot water with this play. He was poking a stick in the eye of conventional Victorian morality and forcing his generally well-to-do audiences to think about the repercussions of their attitudes. As we all know, people do like having to confront the consequences of their actions. They really do appreciate it when you point out their hypocrisies. That, what I said right there, that was another example of a meaning reversal irony, by the way. Second type of verbal irony is ironic understatement. This is when a writer or a speaker deliberately understates a truth. This is super common in medieval literature, like this example from Beowulf. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them, had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Chiefson, scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king. So here's how this passage works. First of all, you get the setup. You got kings with courage and greatness, so we kind of have an overview of what's coming. Then you get a specific example, which is good old Shield. Then you get a string of exemplifications of his greatness. This guy was 10 kinds of awesome. That's, if you look at this, it's basically 4 sentences, about 70 words of nothing but compliments about this guy. This itself is very medieval. It's kind of piling on of superlatives. Then at the end, you get this one little 5-word nubbin. That was one good king. You see this all over the place in English. A hyperbolic string, which is followed by the simplest little summing up that you could want. This is why you can't say verbal irony is saying the opposite of what you mean. Sometimes verbal irony is saying exactly what you mean, but saying it simply in order to intensify the emotion of the thing. The speaker here isn't saying Shield was a terrible king. He's saying Shield was an awesome king. Look at all the stuff that he did. Okay, type 3 of verbal irony is litotes. Litotes is a kind of meaning reversal. It's basically a subset of type 1. In litotes, you say something by stating it in the negative. And I know you're looking at that sentence and thinking, what does that even mean? And so maybe it's better to look at an example rather than me explain it for 5 minutes and still not make any sense. So, you've seen this sort of thing written, or you've heard this sort of thing said, where a person says, you're not wrong. And what they actually mean by that is, you're right. Or why would you do something like that? Why would you just not simply say, you're right? Well, it could be that you don't want to admit that the other person is right that you're talking to. Or you could want to keep them from getting a big head because they're so very, very right. Or you could be making fun of how wrong you were in disagreeing with them in the first place. Or it could be your ego does not allow you to admit that you were wrong and they were right, and so you actually put it in the negative to avoid the ego hit that you're going to take from that. Either way, it is reversing the meaning of what you actually intend to say. There's another type of litotes, another way in which it can appear, which is where instead of stating something in the negative, you say something by using a double negative. And I know if you were wondering what that first one was doing, you're wondering more about this because you've always been taught that double negatives are a really bad thing. So again, I'm going to try to give you an example. You might take a look at this buff fellow and say he's not unattractive when what you actually mean is, oh. This is a classic example of the double negative form of litotes. He's not unattractive. It was not unpleasant. It was not a bad thing. All of these are ways of taking a negative and negating it in order to make a positive without ever actually saying the positive thing that you meant to say in the first place. Here is an example of litotes from Beowulf. A few miles from here, a frost-stiffened wood waits and keeps watch above a mere. The overhanging bank is a maze of tree roots mirrored in its surface. At night there, something uncanny happens. The water burns, and the mere bottom has never been sounded by the sons of men. On its bank, the heather stepper halts. The hart in flight from pursuing hounds will turn to face them with firm set horns and die in the wood rather than dive beneath its surface. That is no good place. What we've got here with this example is actually a twofer as far as verbal ironies go. That last sentence, that is no good place, is a great example of ironic understatement like we looked at before. If you look at this passage, there's a series of descriptors that are hyperbolic in effect, creating a sense of the awfulness of this place that's being described, followed up by a quick little ironic summation. This one, though, is special, rather than the one we looked at where it says Shield was one good king. This one says this is no good place. The writer could easily have written that is one bad place, or that was a hideous place, but instead intensifies the action, intensifies the emotion, the feeling of the thing, by understating it and putting it in its negative. It's so bad you can barely even stand to describe it in terms of its badness. I get this question a lot from students who want to know, what about sarcasm? Where does this fit in? And it's a perfectly reasonable question. Sarcasm is a type of meaning reversal verbal irony, but it is a special type. The word comes to us from a Greek root, sarkazein, which means to strip off the flesh or to tear the flesh. Sarcasm is not nice. It is meant to wound someone. It's like saying, "Great going, genius," or any other bright ideas. Technically, those are ironic, but they're meant to insult and degrade and denigrate rather than to highlight an absurdity or to point out an anachronism or an incongruity. The internet abounds in sarcasm. Here are some memes that you may have run across as you're making your travels around the world. I know you're stunned that the internet is at all sarcastic. That was only a little sarcastic, and that thing I just said was ironic. To me, there is a qualitative difference between saying, "Well, this weather's lovely," when it's raining on your vacation, and saying to the person you're traveling with, "Thanks for the travel tips, TripAdvisor." One of them is drawing attention to the absurdity of your situation, while the other is running down the person who made the travel arrangements. So where have we been? We've defined verbal irony as an overall concept. We've looked at 3 types of verbal irony: meaning reversal, understatement, and litotes. And we've taken a little special bonus trip into the land of sarcasm. I hope that you found this to be helpful. I will be putting a bibliography of sources, particularly from my images, up in the notes once this gets up on YouTube. I'll get to that in a while. In the meantime, I hope that you are all taking care of yourselves, and I will be talking to you all real soon.